Hello, I'm Bruce.
Hi, I'm Aditya.
We are the Risky Scientists, and this is our Risky Wrinkle for the week. This is where we try to iron out something confusing or distorted in the news of the week. So, Aditya, what's our topic this week for Risky Wrinkle?
Thank you, Bruce. Let's talk about social distancing this week, and in particular, the illusion of social distancing.
Or
I
even illusions, plural.
Absolutely illusions plural. It feels like so. If we look at it from the high level, based on some of the things that we've talked about before in terms of risk mitigation, social distancing seems to be a way of controlling exposure to risk, and in particular, exposure to the COVID-19 virus. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would think of social distancing as one form of risk control. So you're trying to control, more specifically, you're trying to control exposure. So
Right.
there, explained before, there are many different ways of controlling risk. You can improve your defenses, you can reduce your vulnerability, or you can reduce your exposure. And this particular form is reducing exposure. So you maintain distance from people who might be contaminated with the virus. So it's one form of control. There are other forms of exposure control. Within exposure control, we're already using these forms. So self-isolation is a form of exposure control. If we remain indoors and don't actually socialize at all, then that's the ultimate form of social distancing.
Right.
Uh, People who are known to be infected, they should be quarantined. So you are in theory removing their exposure to others who could be infected by them.
Mm-hmm.
There are forms of barrier protection, such as wearing face masks, wearing face shields to protect yourself, the use of hanging clear plastic
Yeah.
barriers, which we see in post offices and things like that.
Yeah.
All of those are forms of control on exposure to the aerosolized particles and breath that may be carrying the virus around. So that seems to be the primary form of transmission. Now, all of those forms are useful to list because one of the illusions is that social distancing is the only form of control that we have, and therefore the discourse has become very narrowed about, for instance, what is the correct social distance, or when should we have a social distance or not, a sort of binary choice. So those are other illusions we should talk about.
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought that up because social distancing and what is social distancing? Maybe we should ask that. I think it's defined as different things in many places, but usually there's some sort of distance that it's literally a distance. Stay, I think in the U.S. now everybody's talking about 6 feet, so stay 6 feet away from whoever you're conversing with or interacting with, and frankly, I think that our social distancing rules are rather absurd because what you brought up, Bruce, is that it's not just a thing. And we're hearing now a lot of people say the social distancing. Well, what is the social distancing? As though there's only one social distance. We're not all walking around with 6-foot poles that are attached to one another. And so it's really a rule of thumb and it's a continuum. So I think I want to make the point that I think social distancing, along with all of the other measures for reducing exposure, fall on a continuum, and farther is better. So if you can avoid exposure altogether, I think you absolutely should, right? I mean, there's cases where you must have exposure, and that's when I think the guidelines start to become important, is if you have to have exposure, how do you intuit how far away you should be? And that's where maybe something like a 6-foot guideline is useful. But if you can be 8 feet away, why not be 8 feet away? Or if you can be 10 feet away, why not be 10 feet away? So that's one part of, that's one of the wrinkles that I'm seeing now, is that we're observing, you just go out into the street and you observe people very confused, and then you observe people who think that they're completely safe because they are 6.02 feet away from the next person, and that's bogus.
Yeah,
We also know.
yeah. Sorry, we should point out why that's bogus, right?
Yes.
For one of the reasons being that aerosolized mucus
Right.
that we breathe out normally. This is not limited to just people who have the virus. We aerosolize our mucus, we breathe that out, and you're going to have more of that if you're exercising or you're shouting.
Yeah.
That can linger in the air. So some of the studies we've seen have suggested it lingers in the air. In other words, it doesn't fall to the ground.
Right.
It stays aerosolized in the air for 15 minutes in the open air, and in closed environment, it can
Up to 3 hours.
It can be hours. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is why social distancing is not a foolproof control. This is it's a control which is going to reduce your exposure, but it is not a hard protection. Yeah. In other words, if you walk around 6 feet away from everybody, that does not protect you, because the aerosolized virus can move in the air and get to you, or you can run through it because because it's still lingering there after the people who have expelled it have moved on. Right. So that's why social distancing is not perfect.
And I'd just like to point out that what you just said is an example of lag effects, which we talked about in a previous episode. So you have to think back in history and not just what you're doing here in the moment right now.
Yeah. So I've got another illusion for you. So I've just recently in this week, this is another wrinkle that's emerged this week, is that there is the debate now about whether the social distance should be 2 meters or 1 meter in Europe, or so 6 feet or 3 feet. So the Europeans are discussing, and some American states are discussing, whether we should reduce the social distance, so halve it from 6 feet to 3 feet. And that's going to create an illusion that now there's some new scientific research that says, well, you're safe at 3 feet. We used to think you had to be 6 feet, but now you're safe at 3 feet. And that's not what's going on. Now we're getting issue linkage. Yeah. Where we're saying, because we want to renew economic activity, and it's difficult for places like bars and restaurants to enforce 2 meters, 6 feet, let's just halve it. Yeah. So now what's really going on is not any change in our understanding of safety. It's now we're linking economic activity. We are increasing your exposure to the virus as a trade-off. Exactly. Increasing our economic activity.
Yeah, and exactly, it's a trade-off. You're trading off some amount of risk for the virus to some other risk, and same with however far you are. So let's talk about manners for a moment, because it feels like when you're thinking about social distancing, that's the other piece of this, is that there's an illusion that 6 feet away is safe, but there's also an illusion that all activities are equal.
Yeah.
If you're sneezing, sneezes can probably travel much further than 6 feet, much more easily than just having a mild conversation. Shouting, we know, for example, increases the amount of particles that you're emitting and the amount of mucus that you're spewing into the air. Blowing your nose or coughing. And so these are all things that perhaps come down to agreeing to preserve each other's preserve a sense of civility, so to speak, and reduce the risk for other people, which in turn, because it's a networked population, will reduce your own risk.
Yeah, that's right. So I guess we should conclude with some advice. So what would we say is the best way to think about social distancing?
Well, in my opinion, it is as much as possible, and not. I think the guidelines of 6 feet are a starting point, but if you can be 8 feet away from somebody or 20 feet away from somebody, you should. If you can avoid walking right behind where somebody walked to avoid the aerosolized distribution, you should. If you can go at a time when a store is less crowded, you should. So I think my advice, and I'm curious to hear what else you would add, Bruce, is that as much and as possible, and that The guidelines are just a starting point, and it doesn't mean you're safe. It just means you're lowering your exposure.
Yeah, so I would say the ultimate way to lower your exposure is not to enter the uh, socially contaminated world, which is it's going to sound like a strange way of saying it, but you are safest at home. If you do not receive visitors at home, you do not leave your home. That is self-isolation. That is non-exposure. That is absolute non-exposure. As soon as you socialize, you're going to expose yourself, and we need to be honest that you cannot have perfect non-exposure if you're socializing. So you cannot live with the illusion that you are safe just because you maintain a social distance. So, I think there are some policy implications here. So take Britain, we'll go back to Britain, which we've picked on a lot because it's had some very strange policy contradictions. One of these initially was that people were not allowed to exercise outdoors. In fact, they weren't allowed outdoors, and that included parks, national parks. So hundreds of square miles of national parks, you could be caught by the police and fined for breaking a very strict lockdown in Britain, which makes no sense because you're in the open air and socially distancing as much as you can. You could be miles away from somebody else, and it's very easy to avoid people in the wild. But at the same time, Britain was not enforcing face masks. It still actually doesn't have a requirement for people to wear face masks. It doesn't enforce a social distance. It has advice on how large the group should be that you are supposedly allowed to mix with outside of your own family group. So there's a lot of perversities in how social distancing is marketed as a policy, and I think my advice here is just think about the perversities and the contradictions in the official advice and policies that you're receiving, and just remember what we've taught you about exposure. Just think of everything in terms of exposure, and then your own advice or your own modes of behavior will be a lot simpler to work out.
Absolutely. Minimize exposure in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Bruce. Lovely as always. And I'm very much enjoying these zero exposure conversations.
That's right. Thank you, Dieter. We are the Risky Scientists.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.